Welcome to the Finance Lecture. What if Spirit Airlines did not die because it was too cheap, but because America needed cheap flying to exist, while almost every institution around it quietly made cheap flying impossible to finance? The easy story is that Spirit was a cheap airline, people hated the fees, the planes felt cramped, the brand became a punchline, and finally the company ran out of road. That is the story you tell when you want the room to nod and move on. It is not wrong, it is just too shallow to be useful. The actual answer is stranger. Spirit was not merely selling seats. Spirit was selling the permission structure for cheapness inside a country where nearly every input into air travel had become more expensive. Labor got more expensive. Aircraft got more expensive. Engines got more complicated. Airport space got scarcer. Debt got meaner. Fuel got violent. Even the customer got harder to serve. Not because the customer became bad, but because the whole travel experience became less forgiving. So, look, if you want to understand why Spirit was shut down, you have to stop looking at the ticket price as the business. The ticket price was bait, but not in the cartoonish sense. It was the opening bid in a system of behavioral pricing. The seat got you inside the transaction. The bag, the boarding order, the seat assignment, the printed boarding pass, the bottle of water, the change fee, the bundle, the upgrade. Those were not annoyances attached to the fare. They were the fare, disassembled into pieces. That model only works when the pieces are cheap to produce and the customer flow is thick enough to make up for the anger. You can irritate a customer at scale if the math is strong enough. You can make them wait. You can make them pay for the bag. You can make them feel nickel and dimed. But the aircraft still has to fly. The crew still has to show up. The engine still has to be available. The fuel still has to be bought in real dollars, not in brand attitude. That is where the whole thing starts to break. The public saw a low fare. The institution saw a spread. That spread was the gap between what the customer thought flying should cost and what the system actually required to move a pressurized tube through regulated airspace with trained crews, financed aircraft, scarce gates, insurance, maintenance, call centers, refunds, debt covenants, and fuel exposure. Spirit lived inside that gap. For years, it was brilliant. Not cute. Brilliant. Spirit made a bet that the bottom end of the market was not a niche. It was a continent. Price-sensitive travelers, visiting family travelers, students, seasonal workers, vacationers, stretching a paycheck, people who would not fly at all if the base fare crossed a certain invisible line. This is the part people miss. Spirit did not just compete with Delta or United or American. It competed with not going. It competed with the bus. It competed with staying home. That is a different market. And I mean this because it matters. When a carrier competes with not going, its demand is elastic in a way a premium carrier's demand is not. A corporate traveler pays because the meeting exists. A family visiting Orlando pays if the number is psychologically possible. Raise the fare a little too far and the customer does not trade up. They vanish. Gone. That is brutal economics. That is why the model had to be so harsh. Dense seating, high utilization, minimal included service, ancillary fees, fast turns, point-to-point leisure routes, thin customer support. Everything in the machine had to scream one thing, lower the base fare, then monetize the pain around it. People called that abusive. Sometimes it felt abusive. But structurally, it was closer to a survival mechanism. Here is the hidden mechanism. Spirit's cheapness created a fair shadow over the whole industry. When Spirit entered a market, bigger carriers had to answer. They did not have to become Spirit. They just had to make sure Spirit did not own the price-sensitive search result. That is why the legacy carriers developed Basic Economy. Basic Economy is not just a fare class. It is an anti-Spirit weapon disguised as consumer choice. Delta, American, United, and the others had something Spirit did not have. They had cross-subsidy, they had loyalty programs, they had credit card economics, they had premium cabins, they had corporate contracts, they had airport hubs where route economics could be defended by network logic rather than route-level profit alone. Spirit had the yellow plane and the low fare, right? That is not a small difference. If a legacy carrier sells a cheap seat, it can still make money elsewhere in the stack. Credit card miles, lounge access, first-class upgrades, a connecting passenger filling a hub bank, a corporate account that wants schedule breadth. The cheap seat can be part of a larger machine. For Spirit, the cheap seat was the machine. So when people say Spirit failed because customers wanted more comfort, that is only the surface layer. The deeper issue is that customers wanted more comfort at the same low price. That sentence is the graveyard. The customer wanted Spirit to become a little more like Delta while still paying Spirit prices. The company tried. It introduced more bundled products. It tried to court higher spending travelers. It wanted to reprice itself upward without losing the lower income traveler who made the model work in the first place. That is a hard turn. Maybe impossible. The reason is simple. Once Spirit tries to become more premium, it enters a battlefield where its competitors are not just better funded. They are structurally built for premium. Their entire system is designed to turn status, convenience, loyalty, and flexibility into money. Spirit could add a bundle. It could add a nicer seat. It could talk about high-value options, but it could not suddenly own the trust architecture of a network carrier. I keep coming back to this. Spirit was not killed by one problem. It was killed by a stack of constraints that became nonlinear. A linear problem is a cost increase. You can cut something. A nonlinear problem is when the cuts make the product worse. The worse product weakens demand. Weaker demand forces more cuts, and the whole thing starts feeding on itself. That is not decline. That is a loop. By the time Spirit entered and exited bankruptcy, then entered distress again, the company was trying to solve an impossible equation. It needed to reduce cost without reducing operational reliability. It needed to raise revenue without losing the price-sensitive customer. It needed labor concessions from workers who had already watched the airline shrink. It needed fuel to behave. It needed aircraft availability to normalize. It needed regulators, creditors, employees, lessors, customers, and rival airlines to give it time. That is the one thing distressed airlines rarely have: time. If you have ever watched a restaurant go under, not a fancy analogy, just the real thing, you know the moment. The food is still good. The sign is still lit. The regulars still come in. But the owner is paying vendors late. The best server leaves. The cooler repair gets delayed. The menu gets smaller, and suddenly the place looks alive only because the lights still work. Spirit had that feel. The aircraft were still flying. The website still sold tickets. The brand still existed. But under the floor, the load-bearing beams were moving. The shutdown was not a thunderclap from nowhere. It was the moment the operating fiction ended. The fiction was that a carrier built for ultra-low fares could survive a post-pandemic cost structure, a failed merger path, grounded aircraft, labor pressure, higher debt costs, weaker discretionary demand at the bottom of the market, and then a fuel shock. Any one of those is a problem. Together, they are a trap. And that trap tells you something larger about America. The country loves low prices, but it does not love the systems that make low prices possible. It wants cheap flights, but also punctuality, comfort, labor stability, safety, refund capacity, customer service, new aircraft, and optionality. Fine, but those features cost money. If the customer will not pay, someone else must. Creditors, workers, vendors, lessors, airports, future shareholders. Eventually, the future runs out of pockets. That is the first layer. Spirit was not just a cheap airline that stopped flying. It was the visible edge of a subsidy argument nobody wanted to have out loud. The strange thing about Spirit is that the brand looked more broken than the machine for years, and then the machine turned out to be more broken than the brand. People joked about the airline constantly. The jokes made the company seem weaker than it was when the math worked. Then the same jokes made people miss how serious the failure had become when the math stopped working. A brand can survive ridicule if the unit economics are good. That is an old rule. Some of the most profitable businesses in America are disliked by their own customers. Cable companies, ticketing platforms, banks with overdraft fees, airlines in general, frankly. The question is never whether people complain. The question is whether they complain and keep paying. Spirit had that for a long time. People complained and kept buying. They bought because the airfare search page is a cold-blooded environment. Nobody opens a flight search engine intending to reward dignity. They sort by price. They tell themselves they will tolerate the discomfort. They say, it is only 2 hours. They say, I can travel with a backpack. They say, I do not need the seat assignment. The low fare wins before the memory of the last miserable trip fully loads. That was the psychological engine. But the economic engine depended on a much more delicate stack. Aircraft utilization had to be high. Seat density had to stay high. Labor productivity had to stay high. Maintenance interruptions had to stay manageable. Fuel could not spike beyond the ability to pass costs through. Ancillary revenue had to cover what the fare did not. Capital markets had to remain patient enough to refinance the weak spots. Okay, now put that system under stress. The Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engine issue mattered because it attacked the model at the place most outsiders do not look. It did not merely create a maintenance inconvenience. It removed aircraft from revenue service. A grounded aircraft is not a parked car. It is debt, lease cost, staffing complexity, route disruption, lost seat capacity, and planning noise wrapped in aluminum. You still have a labor force sized for a schedule. You still have customers expecting routes. You still have airport commitments. But the metal is not moving. Reuters reported in 2024 that Spirit expected around 40 Airbus A320neo aircraft to be grounded by December of that year, with the problem projected to get worse the following year. That is not a footnote. For a carrier whose model depends on getting hours out of aircraft, that is a direct hit to the bloodstream. The compensation from the engine maker helped liquidity, but compensation is not the same thing as operations. A credit can help you survive a quarter. It does not restore the missing schedule, the customer trust, the crew efficiency, the aircraft rotation, or the revenue that would have come from flying a full planned network. People who have only worked with spreadsheets miss this. Cash is oxygen, yes, but an airline also needs rhythm. Once the rhythm breaks, every fix creates a second problem. This is why Spirit's aircraft deferrals mattered. Delaying Airbus deliveries scheduled for the middle of the decade into 2030 and 2031 was framed as liquidity discipline. That was true. It was also a confession. Growth had become dangerous. A company built on scale was being forced to shrink. Shrinkage in an ultra-low-cost carrier is not neutral. Scale is how the model breathes. So, look, the obvious question is, why not just cut the weak routes and focus on the strong ones? That is what every turnaround plan says. Focus the network, protect pricing power, reduce capacity, match staffing to the smaller fleet. It sounds clean in a boardroom. In an airline, it is messier. A route is not just a route. It is a crew base. It is aircraft positioning. It is gate use. It is local awareness. It is employee seniority. It is customer habit. It is airport expectation. It is also a signal to competitors. When you leave a city, rivals do not just fill a hole. They study the retreat. They see which markets you cannot defend. By 2025, the retreat was visible. Spirit had emerged from Chapter 11 in March with less debt and new capital. It spoke about redefining low-fare travel. It wanted to pursue higher-value travel options and attract more affluent customers. That was the right language for creditors. It was also the wrong language for the soul of the company. The company was trying to climb out of a low-margin box by moving toward the very part of the market where its rivals had the deepest moats. That is the premium trap. A budget airline can add premium features faster than it can add premium trust. Customers who pay more do not just buy a bigger seat. They buy confidence that the airline will take care of them when the trip breaks. Spirit's problem was that the whole market had changed. The post-pandemic travel boom was not evenly distributed. Higher-income consumers kept spending on travel. Premium cabins performed well. Credit card loyalty ecosystems got stronger. Lower-income consumers faced inflation in rent, food, insurance, and everyday life. The customer spirit depended on still wanted to travel, but the cushion was thinner. This creates a nasty squeeze. The customer most sensitive to price is also the customer least able to absorb travel friction. A flight cancellation that annoys a consultant can wreck a family vacation. A surprise bag fee that irritates a lawyer can blow up a student's budget. A route exit that looks small in market share can matter enormously to the people who use that route because there was no good substitute. That is why Spirit's exit hit certain airports and routes so sharply. Spirit's national share looked small near the end, but in some local markets it was load-bearing. Business Insider reported that after Spirit folded, 17 non-stop routes lost all service, and one airport outside Pittsburgh lost airline service entirely. That is the local monopoly problem. A carrier can be small nationally and systemically important locally. The average viewer does not think in local route concentration. They think in brands. Delta is big, Spirit is small, case closed. But price power lives in city pairs, not in national vibes. If a route took us from two meaningful competitors to one, the traveler does not care that America still has several airlines. Their route just became less competitive. This is the part where the collapse becomes more than a corporate story. Spirit disciplined fares even where people did not fly Spirit. Its presence forced other airlines to keep a cheap option visible. Once Spirit vanished, the cheap option did not vanish everywhere, but the pressure changed. Business Insider cited analysis showing routes with only one competitor rose sharply after Spirit's shutdown, and prior exits were associated with average fare increases around 14%. That is the fare shadow disappearing. And I mean this. The fare shadow was the real public good. Not Spirit's customer service, not the yellow paint, not the jokes, the pressure, the threat that a low-fare carrier could force a market-clearing price downward. That threat had value even to customers who swore they would never fly Spirit. This is why the brand analysis is lazy. Spirit did not fail because the memes were bad. It failed because the machine underneath the memes lost redundancy, engine availability, labor flexibility, debt runway, route concentration, fuel assumptions, post-pandemic demand, competitor imitation. Every layer lost slack. In systems language, slack is the thing that keeps a bad day from becoming a death spiral. Spirit had less and less of it. When fuel spiked, it did not land on a healthy company. It landed on a company that had already sold pieces of its future to get through the present. There is a sentence I wish more analysts would use. A company can be alive and already out of options. That was Spirit. The shutdown date was May 2nd, 2026. The death process started earlier, quietly, in lease negotiations, in route cuts, in pilot furlough notices, in engine inspections, in the failed merger path, in the attempt to sell a better product to a customer base trained to see Spirit as the cheapest possible way to get somewhere. By the time the public saw the final cancellation board, the system had already made its decision. Now we have to talk about the policy layer because this is where people become sloppy. One camp says the government killed Spirit by blocking the JetBlue merger. Another camp says Spirit was doomed anyway and the merger would have merely erased a low-cost competitor more quietly. Both positions contain part of the truth. Neither is enough. The JetBlue Spirit merger was blocked in January 2024. The court agreed with the Department of Justice that the deal would harm ticket buyers by removing Spirit's unique low-price model. Reuters reported that the judge noted rivals cut prices when Spirit entered a market, and that consumers relied on Spirit as a distinct economical option. That is not a weak argument. It is actually the strongest argument for Spirit's importance. But here is the paradox. The policy system protected Spirit's role as a price disruptor while leaving Spirit as a standalone firm that may no longer have had the balance sheet, cost structure, or strategic room to continue playing that role. That is the contradiction. Policy protected the price signal. It did not preserve the engine producing the signal. The court was not crazy. If JetBlue bought Spirit, JetBlue was not going to preserve Spirit as pure Spirit. JetBlue has a different cost structure, a different product logic, a different customer promise. The merger would likely have transformed low-fare capacity into a higher cost, more bundled, more JetBlue-like product. From a consumer welfare standpoint, that is a real harm. The low-fare carrier disappears inside a higher-cost carrier. But if the merger is blocked and the carrier later liquidates, the low-fare carrier disappears anyway. Different path. Similar consumer outcome in many markets. That is the policy trap. The law can stop a merger from removing a competitor, but it cannot easily force the standalone competitor to remain economically viable. Okay, stay with me, because this is not an argument that the judge was wrong. It is an argument that the framework was narrow. Antitrust law is very good at asking whether a merger reduces competition. It is less good at pricing the dynamic risk of a weakened firm failing later under cost shocks, financing constraints, and operating degradation. That is not because people are stupid. It is because the counterfactual is hard. What would have happened if the merger had gone through? Maybe JetBlue absorbed Spirit and fares rise on certain routes. What happened when the merger did not go through? Spirit tried to restructure, shrank, weakened, faced new shocks, and ultimately stopped flying. In both scenarios, the pure ultra low-cost pressure gets damaged. The question is not merger good or merger bad. The question is, which institutional path preserved more low-fare pressure over time? That question is much harder. It requires thinking beyond the courtroom snapshot. The actual answer is that Spirit sat inside an airline policy contradiction that had been building for decades. The United States allowed massive airline consolidation among the legacy carriers. American, Delta, United, and Southwest became the dominant field. By the time smaller carriers tried to survive, the government became more skeptical of further consolidation because the industry was already concentrated. That makes sense. But it also means the smaller carriers are told to compete against giants while being denied some of the merger exits that might let them gain scale. I'm being slightly unfair, but not very. The policy system wanted Spirit to remain an independent check on prices. Credit markets wanted Spirit to prove it could survive. Workers wanted Spirit to honor labor value and job security. Customers wanted low fares with fewer humiliations. Airports wanted service. Rivals wanted Spirit's customers, gates, aircraft, and slots. Each actor wanted something rational. The collective result was impossible. This is what I would call the low-fare preservation illusion. The system tries to preserve the benefit of a low-fare carrier without preserving the conditions that made the low-fare carrier financially durable. It wants the fair discipline, but not the harshness. It wants the competition, but not the fragility. It wants the independent challenger, but not the weak balance sheet. It wants the cheap flight, but not the cheap experience. Spirit's bankruptcy emergence in March 2025 shows the problem. It reduced debt by converting hundreds of millions of dollars into equity and received new investment. On paper, that creates room. But the strategy also required a repositioning toward more affluent travelers. That is not just a turnaround, that is a change in species. A true ultra-low-cost carrier makes a promise that is almost anti-brand. We will get you there for less if you accept the terms. A premium or semi-premium airline makes a different promise. We will reduce your anxiety. We will give you status. We will protect optionality. Those promises require different systems, different staffing, different loyalty economics, different service recovery, different customer memory. Spirit tried to move up while carrying the public memory of being the carrier of last resort. That is hard enough when the operation is healthy. It is worse when aircraft are grounded, routes are cut, workers are being furloughed, and the company is asking people to believe in a future that keeps shrinking. Then came the policy question nobody wanted to own. Should the federal government rescue a failed low-fare airline because its disappearance would reduce competition and hurt consumers? That is not a simple question. On one hand, letting Spirit fail can raise fares and isolate certain markets. On the other hand, rescuing a carrier after years of weak performance can create moral hazard, distort competition, and punish rivals that manage their own risk better. Reports around the shutdown described attempted rescue talks and no final deal. Reuters reported that the transportation secretary said he had tried to get many airlines to buy Spirit but found no takers, and that proposed government-backed financing had been discussed. The final answer was no. No buyer, no rescue, no more time. That refusal is itself a policy act. People think policy only happens when government intervenes. Non-intervention is also policy. It chooses the bankruptcy estate, the creditors, the rival carriers, and the market clearing process over the continuity of the low-fare network. And once the shutdown began, policy moved into cleanup mode. Refund processes, court approval, employee claims, WARN Act litigation. asset sales, route replacement, rescue fares from competitors. That is the life cycle of institutional reaction. Before collapse, debate. During collapse, triage. After collapse, paperwork. The Warren Act lawsuit is especially revealing. Former workers alleged that the company terminated roughly 17,000 employees without the required 60-day advance notice. Spirit's defense and the court process will matter. But the very existence of the claim exposes the labor policy tension in an airline wind-down. If management gives early notice, the operation can unravel before the final flights are safely completed. If management waits, employees experience the shutdown as betrayal. There is no elegant version of that. Airline shutdowns are operationally weird because the company cannot simply close at 5 p.m. Planes are in the air, crews are out of base, customers are mid-trip, maintenance assets are distributed, regulators are watching, airports are exposed. The announcement itself can create the very chaos the company is trying to avoid. That is why Spirit said the wind down was immediate and why reporting described the shutdown as tightly choreographed to get aircraft on the ground. It looks abrupt to the worker and passenger. It may also be operationally rational. Both can be true. That is the ugly part. The policy story, then, is not one clean villain. It is a chain of incompatible goals. Preserve competition, prevent consolidation, avoid bailouts, protect workers, keep fares low, keep airports served, let markets clear, prevent chaos, respect bankruptcy priority, protect consumers. You cannot maximize all of those at once. Spirit was where those goals collided. Labor is usually discussed too late in airline failure stories. Analysts talk about fuel, debt, demand, and mergers. Then, near the end, they mention pilots and flight attendants as if labor were just another cost line. That misses the mechanism. In an airline, labor is not only cost, labor is capacity, labor is schedule credibility, labor is safety culture, labor is regulatory compliance, labor is customer recovery. Labor is the human layer that turns aircraft ownership into transportation. You can own the aircraft and still not have an airline if you cannot staff the operation reliably. Spirit's labor problem was not that workers were uniquely unreasonable. That is the lazy version. The deeper issue is that the whole aviation labor market changed after the pandemic. Pilots became more powerful, training pipelines were strained, major carriers hired aggressively, wage expectations moved. Workers had less reason to accept the old bargain from weaker carriers. That old bargain was simple. Come to the low-cost carrier, build hours, build seniority, maybe move up, maybe stay if the growth story is strong enough. But if the company starts shrinking, the bargain changes. Growth is what makes the pain tolerable. Without growth, the low-cost carrier becomes just a harder job with less security. Right. That is the labor clock. Once a growth airline becomes a shrinkage airline, the labor force starts reading every announcement differently. A route cut is not just network optimization. It is a warning. Aircraft deferral is not just liquidity discipline. It is fewer future seats for crews to fly. A captain downgrade is not just a staffing adjustment. It is a status loss. A furlough is not just a savings line. It is a life event. Reuters reported that Spirit planned to furlough 365 pilots and downgrade up to 170 pilots in the first quarter of 2026, after already furloughing pilots and planning additional reductions. The company also said it would furlough about 1,800 flight attendants, roughly one-third of its cabin crew, effective December 1st, 2025. That is not trimming. That is institutional amputation. The company said it needed to align staffing with a smaller fleet and reduced capacity. That is reasonable in one sense. If aircraft are not flying, you cannot carry the old labor base forever. But a furlough wave also damages the possibility of recovery. It tells employees, competitors, customers, and creditors that the future version of the company is much smaller than the old story promised. This is where labor becomes a signal, not just a quote. A distressed airline can ask creditors for relief. It can ask lessors for lease changes. It can ask engine makers for credits. It can ask aircraft manufacturers to defer deliveries. It can ask employees for concessions. But every ask has a meaning. The ask says the old plan is gone. The more stakeholders are asked to give up, the less confidence remains in the plan itself. The flight attendant negotiations show the human version of this. The union material around voluntary furloughs, involuntary furloughs, benefits, seniority, and bidding rules reads like a map of institutional fear. Who stays covered? Who keeps seniority? Who can vote? Who returns first? Who gets recalled? Who carries risk while management tries to keep the airline alive? These are not abstract rules. They are the texture of a shrinking company. People outside the industry hear seniority and think bureaucracy. In airlines, seniority is life architecture. It affects schedules, base assignments, quality of life, pay progression, vacation, reserve duty, and vulnerability in a downturn. When a restructuring touches seniority, it touches identity. A person does not just lose hours. They lose their place in a system they spent years climbing. So when Spirit asked pilots for major savings and lined up furloughs and downgrades, it was not merely lowering costs. It was changing the psychological contract. Workers could see the asymmetry. Creditors might become owners. Lessors might get planes back. Competitors might hire selectively. Customers might receive rescue fares. But the worker carried uncertainty in the most immediate form: paycheck, schedule, base, seniority, health benefits. And I mean this because it is easy to miss. In a highly regulated, safety-sensitive business, morale is not a soft variable. It becomes an operating variable. The company still has rules and training and oversight, of course, but a workforce that feels the future disappearing becomes harder to schedule, harder to retain, harder to persuade, and harder to rally around a turnaround story. The labor clock also changes bargaining power. When the company is healthy, management can say, "We are growing, come with us." When the company is distressed, management says, "Help us survive." That plea can work once, maybe twice. But if the survival plan keeps shrinking, workers start asking a rational question. Survive for whom? That question is dangerous. It is dangerous because the answer is not obvious in bankruptcy. The company is not simply a family trying to make it through a bad year. It is a legal estate with creditors, claims, assets, contracts, and priority rules. Employees may love the airline. They may love their crews. They may love the route life. But bankruptcy converts loyalty into a claim. A claim has a rank. Rank is cold. This is where Spirit's final shutdown becomes more intelligible. Once rescue financing failed and no buyer emerged, keeping the labor machine active became expensive without generating revenue. OPB and Associated Press. Reporting described Spirit's wind-down plan as focused on selling assets while limiting payroll, leasing, and other costs. In other words, once the operation no longer had a viable future, labor shifted from capacity to estate burn. That sentence is harsh. It is also how bankruptcy thinks. The Warren Act dispute sits right there. Workers say they should have received notice. The company needed to avoid an uncontrolled unraveling. The law demands protection. Operations demand timing. Bankruptcy demands conservation of value. There is no poetry in that room, just claims. Now compare this with the big carriers. A large network airline can absorb labor costs through higher yield customers, loyalty economics, premium cabins, credit card partnerships, corporate travel, international networks, and fortress hubs. Spirit had less room. When labor costs rose, the company could not simply push the increase into a broad revenue machine. Its customer was too price sensitive, its brand had too little premium credibility, its routes were too exposed. That is why labor pressure was not a side effect. It was the countdown timer. Each furlough bought cash while weakening the future. Each downgrade aligned staffing while damaging morale. Each concession request preserved liquidity while telling the market that the plan needed more sacrifice. The company needed workers to believe in a smaller future that might still be worth saving. The workers could see the smaller future becoming smaller. The cruel irony is that Spirit's original model depended on labor intensity being tightly managed, not because workers did not matter, but because the customer paid so little. Once the labor market repriced, the business had to reprice the customer. But repricing the customer meant becoming less Spirit. And becoming less Spirit meant competing more directly with airlines that were better at not being Spirit. That is the trap again. Different door, same room. The shutdown was therefore not merely a financial event. It was a labor market event. It showed that the ultra-low-cost model depends on a specific labor bargain, a specific growth promise, and a specific belief that tomorrow's flying will be larger than today's pain. When that belief breaks, the cost line starts to talk back. Most models do not know how to price that. Workers do. The most revealing moment in a corporate collapse is not always the bankruptcy filing, it is the asset sale. That is when the story gets stripped off and the market tells you what the company was made of. Spirit as a brand was cheap flights, yellow planes, angry jokes, bag fees, and a kind of rough democratic promise. Spirit as an estate was aircraft, engines, airport slots, gates, spare parts, leases, claims, data, contracts, and legal priority. The customer sees the brand. Creditors see the estate. The estate is usually more honest. When Spirit stopped operating, rival airlines moved quickly into the vacuum. Frontier, JetBlue, Breeze, Allegiant, United, Delta, American, Southwest, each had a different kind of interest. Some wanted routes, some wanted passengers, some wanted airport opportunity, some wanted distressed capacity not to disappear in a way that looked cruel to stranded travelers, some wanted to show regulators and the public that markets could respond. But the deeper market was not just passenger routes, it was parts. Reuters reported after the shutdown that Spirit's grounding could ease shortages in the tight engine market, with young Airbus A320neo aircraft being dismantled for parts, and strong demand for Pratt and Whitney geared turbofan engines. Think about what that means. The airline failed as an airline, but pieces of the airline became valuable because the aircraft ecosystem itself was short of components. That is, liquidation as price discovery. The plane may be worth more dead than alive. Not always. But in this case, the engines, auxiliary power units, landing gear, and flight controls had a market that did not require Spirit to survive as a carrier. Once the operating company failed, the asset layer could still feed healthier or more strategically positioned parts of the aviation system. This is not just finance trivia. It tells you why no buyer necessarily had to rescue the whole airline. A buyer of the whole airline inherits complexity. Labor contracts, customer obligations, operating risk, fleet issues, brand baggage, bankruptcy claims, integration problems, fuel exposure. A buyer of assets can choose. Take the useful pieces, leave the mess. That optionality has value. So when officials reportedly tried to find buyers and no one wanted the whole company, that was not irrational. What would they be buying? A distressed carrier with a damaged model, volatile fuel exposure, labor strain, aircraft complications, and a brand that needed both low fares and higher revenue at the same time. It is easier to let the bankruptcy court turn the airline into components. That is the cold truth. Systems do not mourn integrated things if the pieces can be redeployed profitably. Spirit's shutdown also exposed another hidden value, the public value of unprofitable competition. A low-fare carrier can be privately weak and publicly useful. That is a hard category for American policy, because we prefer firms that are either viable and useful or failed and disposable. Spirit was somewhere in between. It disciplined fares, it served certain thin or leisure-heavy markets, it made bigger carriers answer, it also could not finance itself through the final shock. The public value showed up immediately in the route gaps. One airport losing all airline service is not just a travel inconvenience. It is a regional development problem. It affects car rental counters, restaurants, airport workers, tourism flows, family travel, and the political psychology of being connected to the rest of the country. A flight is never just a flight for a smaller airport. It is a proof of inclusion. Atlantic City and Latrobe tell the story better than national market share ever could. Spirit's share of the national market near the end was small, but in specific places, it was the market. That is the tyranny of averages. National concentration can look tolerable while local concentration becomes severe. Okay, this is where the lecture has to get a little uncomfortable. Spirit's collapse will probably help some competitors. It will give them routes, passengers, assets, pricing power, and maybe political cover to expand selectively. It may also make the remaining industry look more stable. Fewer weak competitors, less irrational capacity, more disciplined pricing, better margins. That is good for investors. It may be bad for the traveler who needed the low fare to exist. Markets clear, but they do not clear kindly. That is why the Spirit story is not a simple morality play about corporate greed, government overreach, customer cheapness, or labor cost. It is a system story about what happens when a business model provides price discipline to an industry but cannot capture enough of the value it creates. Spirit created consumer surplus beyond its own tickets. People who never flew Spirit benefited from Spirit's threat. Spirit could not invoice them for that benefit. That is the asymmetric tragedy. The value was distributed. The cost was concentrated. Spirit carried the operating risk, the jokes, the labor strain, the engine exposure, the fuel shock, the debt pressure, and the brand damage. The benefit leaked outward into fair competition across markets. Once the company weakened, the beneficiaries were not structurally responsible for saving it. There is an old line from a mentor of mine, not a famous line, just one of those things that sticks. He used to say that markets are good at pricing what can be owned and bad at pricing what must merely be present. Spirit's fare pressure had to be present. It could not be fully owned. That was its public value and its private weakness. The final fuel shock matters because it turned weakness into impossibility. Reuters reported that Spirit's restructuring plan had assumed jet fuel around $2.24 per gallon in 2026 and $2.14 in 2027, while prices had climbed to around $4.51 by the end of April. That is not a miss. That is a different planet. Fuel is especially cruel to a low-fare carrier because the customer cannot easily absorb the pass-through. A premium airline can push some cost into higher fares, loyalty customers, business travelers, and premium demand. Spirit's customers searched by price. If the fare moved too high, the customer disappeared or chose a competitor with better perceived reliability. That is why fuel did not just raise cost, it attacked demand. Once that happened, the restructuring plan became a document written for a world that no longer existed. This is the part people in finance understand, but do not always say plainly. A plan is not truth. A plan is a bet on the future distribution of variables. Fuel, labor, demand, aircraft availability, creditor patience, regulatory stance, competitor behavior. If the variables move outside the assumed range, the plan becomes theater. And I mean this, the shutdown was the end of theater. On May 2nd, 2026, Spirit's official restructuring site said it began an immediate orderly wind-down, canceled all flights, and told guests not to go to the airport. That is the language of institutional finality, not reduced schedule, not temporary pause, wind down. The word is quiet, but it is total. The deeper lesson is not that ultra-low-cost airlines cannot work. Some can. The lesson is that ultra-low-cost carriers need a very specific ecology. They need cost discipline, aircraft availability, labor alignment, fuel stability, enough scale, enough liquidity, and a customer base that will tolerate the bargain. They also need competitors that cannot simply mimic the low fare while funding it from stronger businesses. Spirit lost too many parts of that ecology at once. If you want the clean final answer, here it is. Spirit was shut down because the company ran out of institutional tolerance. Creditors would no longer finance the operating story. No buyer wanted the whole messy organism. The government did not provide a rescue on terms that closed. Workers were already living inside the shrinkage. Fuel made the restructuring assumptions unusable. Aircraft and engine problems had already weakened capacity. Competitors could absorb selected pieces without absorbing the company. The bankruptcy system could recover more value by selling the parts than by pretending the airline still had a viable future. That is the hidden system beneath the shutdown. Not a bad airline finally getting punished. Not one policy mistake. Not one fuel spike. Not one labor dispute. A whole ecology repriced at once. The tragedy is that Spirit's most important product may have been something it never sold directly. It sold cheap seats. But it produced fear in the pricing models of larger airlines. Once that fear disappeared, the traveler did not just lose a carrier. They lost a constraint. And in markets, losing a constraint is how prices learn to rise.